So that's an example of that. And now we're going to go over a few common objections, because I can feel some people, this is why I put this in the middle of this presentation, there can be a few objections already that people might have as skeptics watching this. So let's go ahead and knock out a few real quick. I can go into much more detail on these, but I'm trying to keep this video under an hour or so. So I want to just go over these shortly with you. So one of them is the four Gospels don't bear the name of an author. It doesn't say the very first page, the Gospel of John, or the Gospel of Matthew, or the Gospel of Mark or Luke, right? So that's the argument. Because it doesn't have their name at the beginning of it, then we don't know who wrote it. You don't understand how silly this argument is from this perspective, from a handling of evidence, from a historical standpoint, or trying to determine something that's legitimately happened from an account. Do you understand how silly? I'm not trying to be disrespectful. Do you understand how silly this argument is? Okay, they don't have to be. John does actually technically identify himself at the end of the gospel, and we just went over that a second ago. So that's, first of all, that's not true. He does identify himself. Number two, this does not take away from any authenticity or reliability of all. For instance, we get calls, emails, messages on social media to the police department all the time where the person wishes to remain anonymous. As in, a neighbor calls to complain about a neighbor but wants to remain anonymous. Oh, his car is parked in the right spot. He doesn't want his neighbor to know he's complaining because he doesn't want any attention knowing. Or there's a party going down the street. There's a party going down the street, click. And they want the noise down, but they don't want people in the neighborhood knowing they're the ones that complained. This happens all the time. Or there's drug dealing going on in my neighborhood or or the apartment complex. Click. We don't know who they are. Oh, I don't know who that is. I'm not going to go check. You still at least check the integrity of the statement, right? And that's what we're doing. Okay, so or an identified informant about a drug bust. We already went over that. So also, here's a real world example as well. Civil War letters have been found not titled. No one assumes that these letters are not accurate or not written by a Civil War soldier. The question is the account from the letters, the Gospels, the email, the text, etc., are they reliable? We find Civil War soldiers with letters on them. It ain't got no first name. It's got bullet holes in it, blood. It's covered it. It'll just be the very end, to my lovely Rachel. XOXO. Oh, so now it's not written by a Civil War guy? Doesn't make any sense. The authors of the New Testament were never challenged. And here's the thing. The authors were never even challenged. Even by the most harshest critics like Celsus. What a blessing he turned out to be. Little did he know. Okay, so Faustus the Manichean, when Augustine retorted, and I will steal his argument in a moment. So there was an argument that the New Testament authors weren't known not until the 4th century, and by Faustus the Manichean, and Augustine retorted him. He's a famous early church father. And the ancient sources of Latin apologist Tertullian, 160 AD, he says the gospel is written by 2 apostles, Matthew and John, and 2 apostolic men, Mark and Matthew. So this is, by the way, a UWBHF, by the way. So Clement of Alexandria, 180 AD, who converted by teachings from Pataeus, which pushes this knowledge back even further because he was taught by someone before him. And it states that Mark's teaching by Peter, Matthew and John were eyewitnesses, and this is another UBWHF. So this is all the accounts from the early church about who them just saying the New Testament was written by. And they're in no disagreement. And they didn't know each other, or if they did, they only knew of each other. They didn't have access to each other's writings. These writings were found independently of each other. So what's the chances of that? Is it possible that they all just guessed and got it right, separated by 150 years, and one's in Turkey, one's in Rome, one's in Syria, one's in Northern Africa? Is it possible they all just guessed and got it right? It's possible. Is it probable? It's not. It's not probable. Some more early church examples to where the New Testament, they knew who wrote them. Regardless, it was so well known, and that's because actually Christians behaved like a criminal organization. I'm going to go over that here about the Hells Angels later. You're going to find this fascinating. Irenaeus of Lyon was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of the Apostle John. So we only have 2 generations past the Apostle John. And what is he? He confirms Matthew and John wrote Matthew and John. Mark recorded what Peter taught, and Luke wrote what he did while being companion to Paul, which makes absolute sense, by the way, Luke's the only Gentile to write in the New Testament and the Old Testament, and Luke was an expert witness and an historian, so it makes sense why God the Holy Spirit would call on him. The Muratorian canon is from the 2nd century. It's a fragment, but it has 22 to 27 books of the canon that we call the New Testament, and that's because it was fragmented. It's not because they didn't have it on the list. And it calls John, by the way, an eyewitness, and Luke was written off reports. And this, by the way, again, is another UBWHF, because that is how Luke describes himself in the Bible. There are others like Justin Martyr and Papias. So you get the drift, right? So none of them are in disagreement of who wrote the New Testament. None of them. Is it just coincidence? It's possible. It's not probable. More probable is that it's reliable witness. That is more probable. Then there's the Q gospel.